from Ireland to Newfoundland in the 1880s. I grew up in Montreal and never had met a native person until in the 1980s. I was in Winnipeg, and the first native persons I met were like many people from all cultures who had been hurt in life and were broken down, and alcohol got the better of them. And so my response was to be kind, but that's all I did. But I met a sister of Zion around 1984, and with her we began an alternative school for young Native children who had got lost in the system. They might be 9 or 10 years old, but hadn't learned to read yet. And so we got an apartment in an old apartment building. Actually, it was abandoned. And she taught these children. My role was to give status to the school, because you couldn't just start up a school, and I was the director of a school, so I signed all the papers for it and did the fundraising for that little school, and did a little bit of tutoring with some of the children and hosted their powwows in the indoor powwows in the winter in the church basement. But that was my experience. That was all I had. I lived in cities and didn't know First Nations people. But then in 1999, I was sent by the Jesuits to Manitoulin Island, and there lived on the Wikwemikong Reserve and on the Chaging Reserve for 7 years. And these people became my friends, and they welcomed me. And they welcomed me very, very generously, so that they would say about me, Nikade Kunye, which means you're a black robe and you belong. Because I am a Jesuit priest, and the Jesuits have walked with the First Nations people for 400 years. If you go up to Midland, where the Huron-Wendat were, you will see a whole reconstruction of Sainte Marie, and you'll see a church there honoring the first Jesuits that walked with them. But they made me know that I belong, and these people are my friends. But I belong to the Jesuits, and I have to say that in the early 1920s, the Jesuits cooperated with the federal government, and they operated a residential school in Spanish Ontario. Among the Jesuits were some very dedicated priests and brothers. There were sisters and lay people, very dedicated, who tried to work that residential school. But the whole system was flawed, and nobody clued into the horror of what was happening to the children and the families. The government didn't provide enough money, and the whole idea of taking children, wrenching them out of their families, away from their parents at the age of 5 and 6, made no sense. And so In addition to that, there were some abusive practices in that residential school. And so there's a whole legacy of suffering that my friends on Manitoulin Island have shared with me. Sufferings that I keep hearing and keep seeing the result of. So in 2008, when Mr. Harper apologized to the First Nations people in Parliament, there was a joy there in my heart. I finally agreed with the government, and it made me want to apologize. And so that very night, I got on the phone and phoned one of my friends in Chiging, and I said, I apologize. I wasn't born then, I wasn't near there, but I apologize as a Canadian and as a Jesuit priest. I said in religious terms a prayer which we say, I confess to Almighty God and to you, my brothers and sisters, that I have greatly sinned in my thoughts and in my words, in what I have done and in what I have failed to do, through my fault, through my most grievous fault. I said that, and I meant it. Last year, on July the 19th, in Bolivia, Pope Francis said this, I say this with regret. Many grave sins were committed against the native peoples of America in the name of God, of America, Canada, the United States, and all of South America. And like Pope John Paul II, I ask that the Church kneel before God and implore forgiveness for the past, the present sins of her sons and daughters against Indigenous people. Now, the sin for which the Church repents is this. First Nations welcomed Europeans. They welcomed the Europeans when they arrived, and the Europeans took their land. The Europeans put them on reserves. The Europeans set up residential schools for them. That is the sin. They based it on strange doctrines. The doctrine of discovery. Well, there's nobody here farming the way we farm in Europe, so this land is for us to take. We discovered it. It's ours. Another doctrine, terra nullius, which means the land of no one. And so with those ideas, they just took it all over. And so, like Pope Francis, and actually Pope Benedict, who also made an apology to Phil Fontaine on behalf of the Church, the Jesuits have made an apology, and we read this apology at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, just acknowledging all the truth that we could possibly gather, and where it applied, we said, we are guilty and we are sorry. But words are not enough. Jesuits are a group of priests and brothers as part of the Church, and our main work is education. And so what we are called to do is to try and change the attitude of Canadians that had that superiority sense and that just went and took things from the First Nations people. So we have made reconciliation, truth and reconciliation, a priority in Canada. We've instructed all the schools, we don't have very many schools in Canada now, but we have 3 high schools, to revise their curriculum so that the truth about Canada, which I never learned when I went to school, will be taught. At Regis College, which is at the University of Toronto, a school of theology that trains priests, they are beginning a course on Indigenous spirituality and social justice. But more exciting than any of that is an immersion course that all young Jesuits will have to take. And the first course begins this summer at the University of First Nations University in Regina. And so they're going to take 2 classes, Introduction to Indigenous Studies, and then Specialties in Indigenous Studies, residential schools. They will, as they're studying, then have insertion in the city of Regina, in the inner city, with First Nations people. On the weekends, they will go to the reserves in the Qu'Appelle Valley, and they will be part of cultural camps. And so the hope is that we Jesuits, and we are part of the Catholic Church, will not make the same foolish mistakes, but also evil mistakes that were made by our ancestors. We also will have on the 19th of June the first dialogue of non-Native people with Native people at Our Lady of Lourdes Church, and Michael Chena and some of the other survivors will speak to people who know nothing about